for being here from all of the variety of places. It's exciting to see people from really like all over that are here. This is fantastic. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Katie Woods, and I'm a library assistant at the Pacifica Sharp Park Library, as well as the author of the novel White Wedding. I'm excited to be here tonight to welcome Meng Jin, the author of Self-Portrait with Ghost. Before we begin, I want to let you know that next month on April 4th, San Mateo County Libraries will be hosting Anna Voloshina for a cooking demo and discussion of her newest book, Budmo, Recipes from a Ukrainian Kitchen. We hope to see you there, especially for a cool cook-along cooking demo. As for tonight's logistics, your microphone and video will be turned off, but please feel free to use the chat and submit your questions in the Zoom Q&A. For those who'd like access to live closed captions for this event, click on CC and then show subtitle. And now San Mateo County Libraries is thrilled to introduce Meng Jin. Meng Jin is the author of Self-Portrait with Ghost, a story collection, and the novel Little Gods, a finalist for the NYPL Young Lions Award and LA Times First Fiction Prize, and longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award. She is a Kundiman Fellow, a David T.K. Wong Fellow, a Steinbeck Fellow, and a Creative Capital grantee. Her narrative prose has appeared in Vogue, Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and elsewhere. She is currently a visiting lecturer in creative writing at Harvard University. All right, welcome, Meng. As we're getting started, would you mind giving either a brief summary of the book or a little reading of one of the stories in this wonderful collection before we begin our conversation?
Yes, thanks so much, Katie, and thanks so much to the San Mateo Public Libraries. It's such a pleasure to be here virtually. I love public libraries. One of these stories, and the title story in this book is kind of a love letter to public libraries as well as to other things. It's really a pleasure to be here. So Self-Portrait with Ghost is a short story collection. It's a little hard to summarize because it's 10 stories that aren't really related to each other, except that they all came from my head during the same sort of period of time. Yeah, I guess as a writer in general, I'm interested in just capturing a little bit of how it feels to be alive and how it feels to be alive in a particular time and place and in a particular body. And I go through little periods of preoccupation with certain themes and subjects. And while I was writing this book, I think I was thinking a lot about sort of on a abstract, far from like the plot level about ideas of self and selfhood, and particularly within, I wrote a lot of these stories during lockdown. So particularly I was thinking about how I think I was feeling some of the constraints of the way that our contemporary society has conceived of self and how isolating and lonely it can be at times. Okay, but that doesn't really tell you that much about the individual stories in this book. So I'll read a little bit from one of them. This is from the last story in the book, called The Odd Woman. And this is the story, this is the one speculative story in the book. It doesn't take place in quite this world. And there are 3 women in this story. And I'm going to read from a character named Ursula's section. To imagine she had laughed the first time. Oh, how she had laughed, defying, slapping her knee. Ursula and Ursula cackling on their backs like a couple of hyenas with the glee of what they'd discovered. A simple problem had started it, a party. Ursula wanted to go and Ursula didn't want to go. Ursula could see herself leaning against the bar, sipping gin from a plastic cup. She would lean into a stranger's life and say, "Is it glamorous? Tell me it's glamorous," and leave the print of her black lipstick on the plastic rim. But Ursula preferred to stay home in her pajamas and drink a vid about a fake person's glamorous life. Ursula wished not to have to look in the mirror, to wonder, am I wearing the right thing? Am I saying the right thing? Am I too drunk, too sober? Not enough of either to be interesting? Why is it so incredibly loud when I breathe? If only I could cut me out, like a psychological surgery, said Ursula. Yes, I'd leave the nag behind, replied Ursula, and save her for when she's useful. Their wishes were granted. Ursula was in bed in her pajamas, hiding under the covers, reciting her little worries and chewing her little nails. Ursula was in bed, and Ursula also stood before the bathroom mirror, preening in the white light. Ursula and Ursula, giggling with disbelief. Ursula was very comfortable on her bed and could imagine lying there curled forever. Ursula swiped black paint over her lips, already starting to feel beautiful, to feel like a dark, sweet beckoning, to be devoured in one untarnished bite. The second time, heartbreak was the cause. You want, said the one who'd sipped from the black-rimmed cup, something I'm unable to give. Ursula denied wanting, but was unconvincing. Ursula wanted everything. Most of all, she wanted to kill her loneliness, which was worse when you remembered being warmly held. To divide herself was a necessity. Broken Ursula, weeping endlessly, drowning in self-pity. She was a tumor. Excise her, said the Ursula who wanted to party, and she did. It became useful again and again to leave a version of herself behind. They didn't really understand it, but they were comforted, thrilled, intrigued by the ability to present one consistent face to the world while the questioning and bickering others remained hidden, each one a secret weapon in her arsenal of selves. While the world positively demanded the division of the self. It was a great comfort, thrill, intrigue, pleasure, logical solution for every Ursula to be the queen of her own place and situation, to know one's characteristic so indisputably and to inhabit it, a fine way to live. Even sorrow, if it was all you had to attend to, could be a pretty thing to turn and look at in different lights. When they realized the magic worked only one way, it was too late. The house was awfully small. Money was a problem. According to the government, which governed reality, only one Ursula had really been born, so only one Ursula could really work. The reasoning Ursula said ground rules. They could leave the house 2 at a time. Doubles didn't turn too many heads, but never more than 2. For most errands, they sent the unassuming Ursula, who dispatched tasks quickly and efficiently and did not draw attention to the fact that she was shopping for a dozen. But only a few of the Ursulas actually liked hiding. Even the Ursula who loved to cook and clean got tired of cooking and cleaning for so many. And then there were the fights about horribly little things. Of course I should go, I'm the clever one, said Ursula. But you've got 0 charisma, replied Ursula. And Ursula would come in waving her hands with conciliatory hope. How about me? They'll like me. I'll make them all feel comfortable and happy and somebody screamed. The scream of a final Ursula being born. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much. I really love that story and the imagining of the Ursulas, the literalizing of splitting the self
Yeah.
into many selves. It was reminding me too of the epigraph for the copy of Anna Karenina that I've been slowly reading. It's like a Yeats quote of, what is it? Disagreement with others, we turn into rhetoric, and disagreement with ourselves, within ourselves, we turn into poetry. So yeah, it's happening there. Yeah.
That's really
Um,
lovely.
yeah, it's a wonderful opening quote. All right, so we'll begin with our conversation. I have so many questions for you, and I'm so excited to be able to learn more about your thinking of these stories. I also want to encourage people to feel free to put questions in the Q&A even as we have our conversation. I hope everyone feels they can be part of the conversation here too. All right. So you mentioned the title story already. It's a love letter to libraries. It also opens with a line from Grace Paley's short story Wants. I was just reading in at the end, your acknowledgements that it has some other sort of references in it as well. Why mention this story in your collection or make these direct references to other pieces of literature, or like in general, how do you think about the relationship between the stories that you love and the stories that you write?
Yeah, I love this question. To answer it very directly, I wanted to pay direct homage to Grace Paley from the start of the story because the story is an homage to that short story once. If you've read the short story once, one thing I wrote this story. I teach that short story. I teach creative writing, and I always teach that short story, almost always on the first day of class, because it's a story. It's about a 2-page story. The title story is maybe a 3-page story. It's about the same length, and nothing quite happens except that the narrator of the story returns some library books. Except through the course of returning library books, you feel the weight of a life, not just one life, but the 2 lives. She also meets her ex-husband on the street in the process of returning these books. And I remember the first time when I read that story, I just thought, okay, I don't have to write anymore because Grace Paley has done it all in 2 pages. Everything I might have wanted to say, she said it in 2 pages. So anyways, I teach this story. I love it. And once I was teaching a workshop that was on sort of using imitation as its theme. The idea was that that like painters learn how to paint by copying the masters. So maybe writers can learn how to write this way. And so I thought I'd try it myself with a story that I love. I had this idea of meeting somebody unexpected on my way to returning library books. And copied the moves that Grace Paley did, or how I read the moves that she did in her short story once. But of course, there's the stories are very different and sort of propelled by different impulses. I think that one of the ways I'm always thinking about, what literature is and what literature does and how to think about it. And in recent years, thinking a lot more about how my ideas of what good literature is have been shaped so heavily by Western conceptions of storytelling and art. And the title story, Self-Portrait with Ghosts, does address that as well a little bit. But this is a long way of getting to my answer to your larger question, which is that I think one thing I've been trying to think about a little differently is that in Western conceptions of the writer or the artist, it tends to be very individualistic and based on individual genius, right? The idea of originality is very important, and almost like a sort of sui generis originality, right? Like that an artist is somebody who's sort of just this special being who is born from nothing and creates their work from nothing but the muses arriving to them.
Unique genius only, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And more and more that seems to me like less of an interesting and true idea. I think that when I think I'm thinking a lot about sort of Buddhist ideas and like Eastern conceptions of art now and Eastern conceptions of creativity. And there are writers and artists in that realm that think of like creativity as a like the world's force, you know, that sort of can express itself sometimes through individual beings. And I think in many ways, I feel so indebted to, I know that like all of my work comes from not just other writers like Grace Paley, but like everything that's come before me and along with me. And I like thinking about, my creativity as just one sort of node in a big sort of swell of creativity or creative forces.
This is reminding me of a passage, or one of the main points of Ruth Ozeki's book, The Book of Form and Emptiness. There's a passage in it that I think about a lot of thinking, like the book sort of becomes a character in that book. The book speaks as well and narrates the idea of the existence of a book, not coming right from a singular person, but is like sort of imagines the idea of writing books as, or books as related like a fungal network under the earth, sort of growing forth from that shared creative impulse and synthesizing everything we've read before and channeling it like through ourselves, but speaking to each other continuously. It's very lovely to think that way. It reminds me,
you know, that I'm reading the Book of Form and Emptiness currently.
Oh, wow.
Because I'm going to be talking to Ruth Ozeki next week about it. So
Wow.
yes, this is
Exciting.
exactly what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, I think she's a monk as well, right? I think
she's a Zen Buddhist priest.
Zen Buddhist priest, that's right. Yeah, very cool. The Pacifica Sanchez Walk and Talk Book Club will be talking about another one of her books next month. So A Tale for the Time Being. So yeah, Ruth Ozeki everywhere all the time right now. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I love thinking about creativity that way and thinking about the ways that these not only work but each other, we're interconnected and form each other, right? Okay, so now this question feels sort of like totally different topic, but that's okay. So many of the stories, so like you said, this is a collection of 10 short stories. They're not especially interrelated, like it's not like characters recur, but there are definitely thematic links and similarities. One of the things I noticed across the stories is many of the stories within them span decades, and characters either age chronologically forward or remember the past. Characters become children into adults, or sometimes they're thinking across time and time and physical space as well, which I guess I'll get to the next question. But yeah, did it come naturally to you to want to write those large swaths of time? Was that a decision? How did you navigate that, like thinking of these larger scopes of life on the page?
Yeah, I think it came naturally to me for the most part. I tend to I always tell my students when talking to them about character that characters live their entire lives, and when we tell stories, we're sort of entering at a certain point and exiting at a certain point, but their lives, you know, have started even if their lives have started before we've joined them and continue after we leave them. And even if it's if the story starts with the birth, the person was born of somebody in a particular circumstance, right? And that the person who gave birth to the character was also born of somebody and came from and created of many circumstances. So I think that because I think of the characters um, in this way, it feels natural for me to dip into different parts of their lives that feel relevant to a particular story, or like they're speaking to the same part of that character, right? Um, yeah, I think there is one. I remember one story intentionally doing a massive sort of time, um, a sort of like paragraph of time accelerating forward in Selena and Ruthie, which is mostly about a middle school best friendship, and then towards the end of the story, it's like a yeah, basically one paragraph, like decades pass. And I remember that that I wanted to do this and felt sort of permission to do this after a period of reading a bunch of Alice Munro stories. And and Alice Munro, of course, is like the goddess of the short story. Um, and uh, and she's whenever I read Alice Munro, I am surprised by how much like wilder and crazier she is than I have imagined her to be. Like somehow in my mind, she's this like sweet Canadian woman, and her stories are just like these beautiful, like sweet little stories that are perfect realist descriptions of life. But then you get into them and they're like, she does whatever the hell she wants, including things like fast forwarding decades in one paragraph. And sometimes when you read something so exciting like that, you're like, wow, I can make that happen. And the feeling of reading it is so it does something to like your perception of time as a reader that was so thrilling to me. And I wanted to mimic that in Selena and Ruthie. Um, and I think I'm also, like I said, that I'm interested in, the idea of a self, whether that exists, whether it's constant, um, and I guess one thing that I'm constantly sort of thinking about is how people's selves evolve over time, right? And how one can be unrecognizable to oneself. Um, and yeah, jumping in time allows you to explore those questions.
Completely. There's this is like outside of the actual big paragraph that does the immediate rush, but it's soon after in the story. A line in Selena and Ruthie that I really loved, that it's so great that you do this, that we go forward in time and then she's about to watch an opera and she reflects like kind of on the past already again. We're in Selena's point of view. The future had been an open field then, opaque and blinding white. In the blindness, a million paths waited to clarify into color and shape. She had not known enough to imagine what any one path might look like, or understand that to take one might preclude your journey on another. We get her young and then reflecting on the way she'll take shape her life in the future too, which is very cool stuff. That all of that is there. Yeah, that the characters are also capable of reflecting on these same questions that you're reflecting on as a writer too, which sometimes I feel like I don't give my characters enough of their own intelligence, which I should do. Yeah. So yeah, I have a similar question just about space and place, that you also, as you move across time in large ways, you also move across the world in different locations in this collection. Characters in the United States, a lot in San Francisco specifically, or in China, or in moving in between. Yeah, what interests you about a character's or a story's relationship to place?
Yeah. Going off of our Ruth Zeki bent, since my mind is very much on Ruth Zeki a little bit now too. And this idea that I first encountered in her fiction of of no self, right?
Mhm.
That maybe we're actually empty and made of the forces that come through us at a certain point in time or space. I do feel that place is one of those things that really, for me, very strongly shapes my sense of self. Language as well, um, which is often very strongly tied to place. Um, yeah, so I guess I'm very interested in the ways in which certain places can bring out certain aspects of a person's self, and change a person and determine who they are. Yeah.
Yeah. This goes nicely into, I had a question about language too. There are references that the languages characters speak, but also like the way they're speaking those particular languages. There's a grandmother who is described as speaking in dialect, then switching to Mandarin, a narrator who is imagining meeting a ghost who's speaking, who in their imagination is speaking English, but that their narrator realizes it's a language that that ghost in real life didn't know. There are Chinese in-laws that speak in disorienting degrees of Southern drawl, is the quote. There's a lot of references to even just the ways people are using language. Um, and of course, you're inscribing these stories in language, right? You're using language to shape them as well, using language like a paintbrush, as you said, you teach your students. So where, how much are you thinking about, I guess, yeah, what is your thinking about language as you approach these stories, both as like crafting the stories, how it works between characters, how it like opens up and closes off moments of connection? I don't, yeah, this is a very broad language question.
Yeah.
But it it becomes interesting like that you can still also put things on a page, right? And not sort of spiral into language's many possibilities and feel frozen by them. Maybe that's true.
Yeah. Um, I think that I think that writers work within like this fundamental tension with language, right? With the impossibility and the failure of language. That we are trying, in fact, to put things into the reason that fiction exists, I think, for me, the reason that fiction, that maybe not fiction exists, the reason that my fiction exists,
Uh-huh.
is that there are things that I feel and think, that and have experienced that don't that feel impossible that feel like they cannot be expressed in language. Therefore, I must find a kind of fictional container to hold it, and like allow it to somehow be expressed indirectly in language. And I think this is something that many writers feel regardless of their relationship to any particular language. But for me, as a person who is most fluent in the language not of her birth, um, not my first, English is not my first language, and whose the majority of my family members and the people who are close to me don't speak English, and and I don't speak very well their languages, um, which are various dialects of Chinese. I'm receiving. I think this like the failure of language is is much more evident and sometimes painful because of that. Because so often I'm receiving information. I mean, everyone receives information about the world in a fragmented and incomplete way. But when you're hearing stories from your family members that you feel like you can only partially understand because you don't have a full grasp of the language, then things come to you in little pieces, and there's so much absence, um, and the desire to sort of like fill in those holes can be um, a driving force
Mhm.
to write. So I think, I mean, that's sort of the personal reason behind like my attentiveness to and interest in various languages and dialects. Um, and and yeah, I'm very grateful to have like a facility with English and one and like to like be able to find a lot of like great beauty in the English language. But it's a complicated relationship with this language.
With this clunky thing that we have to
Yes,
use.
yes.
This sort of is making me think of and really appreciate the moments throughout the collection when characters connect through other sensory information too, like taste is one
Mhm.
I'm thinking of in one story, or like ritual of food or things like that. So yeah, there's being able to use language to express those other sensory connections is sort of a beautiful thing there. Um, okay, let's see here. Do, do, do. Okay, yes. We're gonna go back to time a little bit as a question. You have a story even called titled "In the Event,"
Mm.
which is it could have been also called like "Unprecedented Times" or something. Like these phrases that become more and more familiar to us. A narrator says, "What was wrong with me? Why didn't I want to be a witness to history, to any kind of passing time?" And much of this book sort of proclaims, it's interesting that there's some moments in the book where narrators are really struggling against like trying to the idea of making art of the moment. But this book is also very much described as one born of the moment of like the turbulent years of Trump's administration. And the time that the book was being written was so intense and sort of almost like capturing us in our awareness of time and the moment. I wonder what your experience of that was, of writing around and about and at all that history, and also like your relationship overall with like topical fiction
Yeah,
or your interest in that. Yeah.
yeah. Um, hmm. Would you call this book topical fiction? I'm curious.
I I don't I think that it exists outside of the time, but I'm thinking about how it's very much like described, like just looking at
Right,
the copy, the cover copy, which
right,
is
right,
um
right.
that we feel like the pandemic and there's references to lockdown. But I wonder if you felt any like pressure to write of the time or to resist that feeling of
Yeah,
that you had to do that. Yeah.
yeah. I think I was mostly resisting that feeling. I think during the intensity of those years when I was writing these stories, it still kind of like astounds me to think about how intensely like emotional I was, like when, for example, Trump was elected, and like through all the now that it's like hopefully, oh God, hopefully in the past. Um uh yeah, I have a little bit more distance, but I remember at the time feeling um, quite tortured by the fact that I was just sitting at home writing stories, which is
Mm,
actually something it's like it's deeply pleasurable for me, right? It's like it writing brings me incredible joy and calm and peace, um, and and this in the story in the event, which the story is about a musician, and there's sort of wildfires all around her in the
mhm,
world, and disasters um, in the news every day, which we're all familiar with. um, you know and she she sort of hides herself in a bunker to write music.
Mhm.
And that's really, I mean, I guess that's sort of sometimes how I felt when I was writing stories at that time, that I was hiding myself in a bunker, that I was there's a writer named Tove Ditlevsen who wrote the Copenhagen trilogy. Have you read those?
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
They're really wonderful. She writes about how when she writes, she feels like sentences or words and sentences are sort of wrapping themselves around her in a protective film,
Mhm, mhm,
which I relate to incredibly.
mhm.
But when the world is burning outside, you can feel like, what am I doing here, wrapping myself up in sentences when I could be putting out fires maybe, or who knows what else. um, so I think these stories were actually really struggling with the question of like, what is the use of art? What is the point of art? Especially in times of crisis, right? In times of political, environmental, socioeconomical
Mm.
crisis. And I don't have an answer to that question. If I had an answer, I wouldn't have to write all these weird stories. Um, but one thing that I I told myself, as a comfort maybe, and I don't know how true it is, but I think it's a little true, is that one very small thing that writers can do is to witness, right? That um, there are so many precious things in this world that are disappearing, because of um, many forces, and precious things deserve to be witnessed. So that's one very small thing. It's maybe not very useful for like solving crises, but but it's a small thing that we can do, and that's I guess um, the way that I addressed and tried to resist like that impulsive um, topical
Mhm.
writing.
Yeah, I relate to everything you just said very strongly. Someone who writes and tries to exist in the world with that sensitivity that also can make like the sensitivity to witness things and bring them onto the page. And to be present in the world can also be very overwhelming when things are overwhelming, right? As well, like trying to keep that. Not even there's the side of being like, what I'm doing useful for the world, and also like how do we keep our like hearts alive in the space of the world at the same time as creators and as people, which I think is a question in this collection as well, right?
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
I've read
for
in other
sure.
interviews that you've done that you've talked about really wanting to write from a place of um, honoring like the beauty of the world and not writing necessarily from a place of indulging in sadness or that everything is um, or like kind of a wallowing. And yeah, can you talk a little bit about the importance of the beautiful, I guess maybe you kind of already did, but the beautiful things that you're drawn to capture on the page, or why beauty or good, not goodness, yeah, beauty is a important thing to you.
Yeah, goodness, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess
The creative
I'm like
write
suspicious of that word, I think somehow.
Yeah, well, it's because it's so, like, loaded with whoever is saying it, right? Like, what they mean by it. Um, yeah, I mean, I actually right now, the class that I'm teaching, in university is called The Good Stuff, and it's all about, pleasure and, joy and delight and beauty and wonder. And again, like this is sort of one of the ways that I'm trying to rethink the way that I approach literature and artistry. I think when I was coming up and learning how to be a writer, like the vision of the tortured artist was very
Mm,
prominent, right?
mhm,
And
mhm.
that, like, in order to be sort of important, you had to write about suffering. And in order to be a be a good artist, you had to suffer.
Mhm.
And quite frankly, humans suffer.
Mhm.
Every
Mhm.
human suffers. It's not it's not um it's well, yeah, it's not something that's special to artists. And
What?
and the more I write, I think the more boring suffering is to me. And especially perhaps because, I mean, maybe this is also a sort of reaction to the times that this feeling that what the things I want to write, I feel maybe um, I'm drawn to write in a certain way out of like a desire for balance, maybe.
Mhm.
That if like the atmosphere of the world sort of feels full of a certain type of story, right? And in particular, in the last sort of like, few years that we've been alive, there have been quite a few stories of grief and suffering, and particularly, I think if we're talking about like um, stories of othered people, people within minority groups or marginalized groups. Stories of racialized suffering have become very popular, and I think whenever there's one type of story that sort of takes over, it can be it can be flattening. It can have a flattening effect, and it can actually, to me, it can diminish like the dignity of the suffering, right? We, every person knows that every person who suffered knows that within that there are moments of joy and beauty and surprise, and that life is like very multifaceted and multivalenced, and to present a sort of full picture of it would require sort of attentiveness to the other things. And I think it's hard to write about. It's hard to write about the good stuff
Mhm.
because it could easily come off like sort of cliche, right? Or hollow. So so yeah, I'm that's the kind of writer I want to become more and more, is a writer who loves the world more than she hates it.
Yeah. That has it all. I think loving the world is including all those things. It can't come off as hollow. It's funny, I think you're totally right that the wanting to write about hardship and suffering is ingrained in us in that story of the suffering writer and what makes worthwhile topics. And also sometimes for me, it's like, well, I can only justify the cocooning of myself in writing if it's like hard. And if I really like am laboring over it, then it's okay that I'm spending my time doing this, like the relationship to work having to be also
Right.
hardship, right? Which is not necessarily the relationship to work that is even sustainable. Like just even the labor of doing it. If it's not, if I'm enjoying it, then it's not real, which I don't know, that's a very silly idea in some ways. Um, and things can be funny. Like I feel like we haven't talked about the fact that your collection is also very funny. Many of your observations
Oh,
in
thank
it
you.
are very funny. Um, okay, let's see. Oh, okay. So we're going to kind of zoom out into just the overall shape of the book here. So your first book, Little Gods, is a novel. What are some of the new challenges or delights of writing a collection of short stories, of organizing, revising, putting together a collection?
Yeah, I will say that I found it much more delightful and less challenging. Sorry to people who say that a short story is harder to write than a novel. I disagree. Uh, it's much shorter and easier to write than a novel, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think for me, short stories, I felt so free writing these stories because I knew they wouldn't stand alone in a book, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
I think with my first novel, I had like, especially because it was my first novel, I had no idea if I was going to publish again, you know. I had no idea what was going to happen to it. You know, so I had this like maybe crazy idea in my head that
Mhm.
a novel had to like contain everything I'd ever thought about
Yeah, it has to.
and
It's your
cared
one
about.
chance to put it in the world, right? Yeah.
It's my one chance. You know, I like basically, I think I literally said to people, like, once I'm done with this novel, I can just like die and I'll be okay. Which
It's also so
sometimes, you
funny,
know, like,
yeah, to imagine that that's
yeah,
all, like, I know all I'll ever know at this point
yeah,
in my
exactly,
life. Yeah.
exactly.
Relate. I'm
But like
laughing because I
that's
relate. Yeah.
yeah. But I mean, that's sort of like a ridiculous, ridiculous task to give yourself, and makes putting together a cohesive story perhaps a little difficult.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, but the fact that these are short stories, and also the fact that it's like that's my second book, so it's not now it's like, oh, I have many chances to, I'll have more chances to like make books. I felt so free. I felt like the stories, like I felt like if I opened a door in one story, I could walk through it in another, or like I
Mm,
could,
mhm,
if I told a certain type of story in a certain way in one story, I could sort of like turn around and tell that same type of story from a different way, and that none of them
mhm,
would have to stand alone. They could speak to each other, and they could sort of come together as a whole. I do think that like I talked about Alice Munro earlier. Her stories are like small novels and
mhm,
her story
mhm.
collections are sort of like they're literally just like collections of stories. It's like, oh, she wrote these stories and now they're together in a book.
Mhm,
They're
mhm.
not
Yeah.
necessarily the book, it's like you could mix them up and put them in different books and it wouldn't really like change, I think, the nature of the stories. And I hope that that's true and that the stories stand alone. But I also did think about putting this book together as a book, and the order of the stories, and it feeling like a whole object comprised of independent parts. Um, there are some wonderful story collections that I thought about while putting it together. One of them is Nam Le's The Boat, which starts off with an auto-fictional story about, and this was years before autofiction was a word, um, about a writer named Nam who is at the Iowa Writers
Mm,
Workshop,
mhm.
who has writer's block and sits down and writes an ethnic story to please his classmates. And then the story collection sort of, and in that first story, there's almost like a table of contents for the rest of the stories, and the story, and then it ends on the something that could be quote unquote the ethnic story, right? And there, in I loved that collection because it felt to me like a collection, like a book
Mhm.
that took you on a journey through these individual stories. And then Garth Greenwell's Cleanness also. I read that sort of while I was doing my very final edits in this book. And that helped. And cleanness, he talks about cleanness as like a song cycle or a leader cycle. Something from opera, I think, that I don't
Uh-huh.
know. But maybe like in my head, I was like, oh, it's like an album. Um,
Yeah.
but but you know, like an album, the songs are in a particular order for a particular reason. And so I thought about that too while I was putting the collection together.
Yeah. I've been working on something that I've been starting to think of, like, having stories emerge in the way like a song in a musical would emerge, right? When does a character need to like speak hugely? So these can be these fun organizing principles. I love hearing about the specific collections. I actually haven't even read Cleanness, which I feel like based on my own work would be like very
Yeah, you would
relevant,
love it.
but I need to read it. It's been another great short story collection that I'll throw out to recommends that is very consciously interlinked. Like some characters do reappear, but the story is still also, it is a short story collection. Is The New Low by Jennifer Lewis, another San Francisco based writer, from Nomadic Press, which is sadly closing. So this is a book to support, from a local small press. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So we're getting close to the end here. I'd love to hear any questions from people who are here attending, or I have others I can also ask. I'd love to hear questions from anyone here if you have them. In the meantime, I wondered, because we're talking about the organizing and shape of the book too, could you talk a little about the origin and inspiration of Where Is One? We have these really beautiful illustrations in between sort of like trios of story. Woo! There, how can I do this? I wonder if I can. Oh, there we go. Can you talk a little about the choice to have sort of parts of the book broken up by these silhouettes?
Yeah, this is a perfect segue from the last question. Okay, so in Cleanness by Garth Greenwell, which I was just talking about, I don't remember exactly how it's broken up, but the book is broken up into sets of 3 stories, and I think there are 9 stories total. There are 10 stories in mine. And I was reading it and doing the final edits of this book on at this lovely writing retreat with some of my friends who are also writers. And it was the first time, it was like that like glorious summer when we thought that COVID was over before like Delta or something. So it was like I was seeing my friends for the first time in like a year and a half, and finishing this book and reading this beautiful book in the beautiful woods of Northern California, um, and feeling so much love towards these people. And also reading Cleanness and feeling so much pleasure when the break between the 3 stories would come. It was like, I felt like Garth was telling me, "Okay, you've read some stories, you should close the book and, like, go take a walk, or, like, go take a bath." Um, and so I thought, yeah, like, maybe I should, give my readers a little break like that, and I started to think about how stories come together in little groups. And they did, when I started thinking that, they came naturally into these little groups. And at the same time, I was, hanging out with these other writers. And there was one night when we were doing some writing activity together, and I like finished writing early, and I looked around and I saw their profile, and I realized, and many of these women were Asian women, and I realized that I'd never considered sort of the profile of an Asian woman. That in my mind, the my imagined profile of a woman was of a white woman, of the and that I and so I started drawing their profiles and realizing that because of our sort of not inset eyes and kind of flat noses and small mouths, that our profiles are sort of just like little lines with disruptions. So I started thinking, well, what if my section breaks were like, instead of Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, were just little profiles of women in that are like little lines with disruptions. And I actually used the my friends I went off of the little sketches that I did at that retreat for these the drawings in the book.
They're your actual drawings too, which is such a lovely, yeah, or sort of, yeah.
Drawings.
Well, it's good,
Yeah.
it's also,
Yes.
it's lovely that it's your work as well, your portraits of friends too, which is a beautiful thing in a book about called a self-portrait as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Love that story. Okay, I think we're about at the end. I had another question, but I think we're out of time. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing and talking about everything you're thinking about and putting this book together and the craft elements of it as well. Thanks to everyone else who is joining us here tonight. Please check out our upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. We would also appreciate it if you could tell us how SMCL did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. And then I hope everyone has a great night and reads this lovely book as well. Thanks so much for being here. Yay.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you all invisible people.
There's some lovely stuff in the chat as well. Yeah. Some nice words for you. Yeah, and you can also join the conversation on Fable, where we're having a virtual book club as well. Thank you, everyone. Bye.